In the summer of 1518, a woman in Strasbourg stepped into the street and began to dance wildly, uncontrollably for days. Soon, hundreds joined her, dancing until they collapsed, some even to their deaths. This is the true story of the dancing plague, a 500-year-old mystery that still baffles us today. Let's travel back in time. Picture the city of Strasbourg in July of 1518. It's not the clean, picturesque city you might imagine today. The streets are narrow, paved with rough cobblestones, and crowded with timber-framed houses that lean against each other. The air is thick with the smells of summer, baking bread, horses, and the faint scent of the nearby river. Life is hard, and for most people, every day is about survival. And in one of these houses lived a woman known as Frau Trophia. We don't know much about her. She wasn't a noble, she wasn't famous. She was an ordinary person, living an ordinary life. Until one day, she wasn't. On a hot morning, in the middle of July, Frau Trophia walked out of her front door into the middle of the narrow street, and she began to dance. Now, you need to understand, this wasn't a dance of celebration. There was no music. Her face wasn't filled with joy. It was a mask of something else. Confusion, maybe, or terror. Her arms flailed, her legs kicked and twirled. But there was no rhythm, no grace. It was a frantic, desperate series of movements that she seemed to have no control over. At first, her neighbors probably didn't think much of it. Maybe she had a little too much wine. Maybe she was just letting off steam. A few might have laughed, others just shook their heads and went about their day. Her husband, we can assume, rushed to her side. He likely tried to calm her, to hold her still, to ask her what was wrong. But her body wouldn't listen. It was as if she was a puppet, and some invisible force was pulling the strings. He couldn't stop her. An hour passed. Then two. The hot summer sun beat down on the street. Frau Trophia was still dancing. Her dress was soaked with sweat. Her hair was a mess, but she kept moving. Her feet, in their simple leather shoes, must have been screaming in pain on the hard stones. As the day wore on, people started to notice that something was seriously wrong. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a drunken display. She didn't stop for water. She didn't stop to rest. Her body just kept going, jerky and relentless. By evening, a small crowd had gathered, watching from a safe distance. They weren't laughing anymore. They were whispering, their faces filled with a mixture of pity and fear. The sun went down, and the cool night air settled over Strasbourg. But in the dim light of the moon, one figure remained in the street, still twitching, still spinning. Frau Trophia, danced through the entire night. By the time the sun rose on the second day, her body was exhausted, her movements weaker, more like spasms. But she did not and could not stop. This was no ordinary dance, and while no one in that small, frightened crowd could have possibly known it, this was not the end of a strange event. It was the beginning of something that would infect their entire city. A phenomenon that no doctor, no priest, and no authority could ever hope to stop. For days, Frau Trophia danced alone, a spectacle of horror and pity. People brought her food and water, trying to press it to her lips as she convulsed. But she barely seemed to notice. She was a prisoner in her own body. And then the unthinkable happened. It started with a woman in the crowd. Maybe she'd been watching for hours, her mind numb with the sight of this endless, frantic dance. Suddenly, her own foot began to tap, not in time with any music, because there was none, but with a jerky, involuntary rhythm. She probably tried to stop it, pressing her foot flat against the cobblestones. But it was no use. Her leg started to twitch. Then her other leg. Within minutes, she stumbled out of the crowd and into the street, her body now flailing with the same uncontrolled energy as Frau Trophia's. A man cried out, pointing. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. This was no longer just one person's strange affliction. It was spreading. Another person, a teenage boy who had been mocking the scene just a day before, felt a tremor in his hands. He clasped them together, trying to still them, but the shaking moved up his arms, into his shoulders, until he too was pulled into the macabre dance. One by one, from the crowd of horrified spectators, more people were consumed. 4 dancers became 10, 10 became 20. All moving without purpose, without joy, their faces twisted in anguish. Now, before we dive into how the city officials tried to handle this escalating crisis, if you're enjoying this story and want to help our channel grow, please take a moment to click the subscribe button and give this a like. It really helps more people find our content, and I'm genuinely curious. So drop a comment below and let me know what time it is, where you are listening from. It's fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Thanks for your support. So now you have a group of 34 people dancing uncontrollably in the heart of Strasbourg. The street is no longer passable. The initial whispers of fear have turned into outright panic. People are barring their doors, peering out of their windows at the scene below. They are afraid to even look, terrified that just the sight of it might be enough to infect them. Imagine the sound, the scuffing and stamping of dozens of pairs of feet on stone. The heavy, ragged breathing of exhausted bodies, the occasional cry of pain or despair. There's no music, just this chaotic, human rhythm of suffering. The local doctors and city council members were summoned. They stood at a safe distance, their faces grim. They had never seen anything like this. Was it a curse, a divine punishment? Or some new, terrifying disease? They debated amongst themselves, offering theories. Some said it was hot blood, a medical idea of the time where the body was too hot and needed to release the energy. Others whispered of demonic possession. But theories were useless against the reality unfolding in front of them. The number of dancers was growing every single day. Soon, it would be over 100. The city was grinding to a halt, paralyzed by this dancing plague. As the group of exhausted, delirious dancers multiplied, the city's leaders faced a growing, unstoppable nightmare, and they had absolutely no idea what was causing it or how to make it stop. With no idea what was causing it and no idea how to make it stop, the city leaders had to do something. And what they chose to do next was a catastrophic mistake. Guided by the best medical minds of the 16th century, they came to a strange conclusion. They decided this wasn't a curse or a spiritual problem. It was a natural illness caused by what they called hot blood. Their theory was that the dancers' bodies were overheated, and the only way to cure them was to let them dance the fever out. Their solution: more dancing. You heard that right. Instead of trying to restrain the dancers, they decided to encourage them. They cleared out two of the city's largest public spaces, the grain market and the horse fair. They even ordered a large wooden stage to be built right in the center of the chaos. Then they hired musicians, pipers, drummers, and fiddlers were brought in to play music day and night, to create a lively atmosphere that they hoped would help the dancers burn off the sickness. But the music didn't help. It made everything worse. Imagine the scene: a huge wooden stage surrounded by hundreds of people twisting and jerking uncontrollably. Musicians are playing upbeat, cheerful tunes, but the dancers are not smiling. Their faces are blank with exhaustion, their eyes wide with terror. They aren't dancing to the music. The music is just a horrible soundtrack to their endless suffering. And the spectacle, now officially sanctioned by the city, drew even bigger crowds. It was no longer a frightening event hidden in a side street. It was a public performance. And as more people came to watch, more people were pulled in. The constant, driving rhythm of the drums seemed to hypnotize them. And the sight of the writhing bodies was impossible to look away from. The cure became a poison. By early August, the number of dancers had exploded. It wasn't 30 or 40 anymore. It was nearly 400. The streets of Strasbourg were filled with a mass of humanity locked in a grotesque, unending dance. The rest of the city was a ghost town. Shops were closed, workers stayed home. Fear hung in the air, thicker than the summer heat. A human body is not meant for this kind of stress. Days of non-stop movement, with little food or water under the blazing sun. Their feet were bloody and torn, their bodies frail from dehydration and pure exhaustion. The crowds watched in horror, no longer just afraid of catching the plague, but of witnessing their neighbors, their friends, dance themselves into the grave. The situation grew dire. Soon, the dancing would claim its first lives. The music played on, a relentless, cheerful sound that felt like a mockery of the horror unfolding. The stage built by the city leaders was now a scene of utter devastation. The dancers, some of whom had been moving for weeks, were no longer just exhausted, they were dying. It started with one. A man in the middle of a convulsive spin simply collapsed. He didn't stumble. His body just gave out. He fell to the wooden stage with a heavy thud that was audible even over the music. People rushed to him, but it was too late. His heart had stopped. The crowd gasped, a wave of shock rippling through them. This wasn't just a strange sickness anymore. It was a killer. Soon after, another fell, and then another. The causes of death were brutal and swift. Heart attacks from the constant strain, strokes from the relentless physical exertion, dehydration and starvation. Their bodies were shutting down one by one. Historians believe that at the peak of the plague, as many as 15 people were dying each day. The hired musicians, who had at first played with professional energy, now played with fear in their eyes. They had been ordered to play, but they were providing the soundtrack to a massacre. The stage had to be cleared of bodies constantly. Strong men would wade into the crowd of flailing dancers, carefully avoiding their jerky limbs, to carry away the dead and the dying. The city officials watched, their grand plan crumbling into a nightmare before their very eyes. Forcing the dancers to continue had been a fatal error. The cure was far worse than the disease. Panic turned into desperation. The medical explanation of hot blood was clearly wrong. They had tried science, and it had failed spectacularly. So, they abandoned it. If medicine couldn't solve this, they reasoned, then the cause must not be physical. It had to be something else, something spiritual. They now believed the dancers were not sick, but cursed. Specifically, they decided that a saint must be angry with them. They looked for a saint known for inflicting curses, and they settled on one, Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus was a Christian saint who, legend said, could send down plagues of compulsive dancing as punishment. The city council, in a complete reversal of their earlier policy, declared that the dancers had been cursed by him. The stage was torn down. The musicians were sent home. Silence fell over the city, broken only by the haunting sound of scuffing feet and ragged breaths. This new diagnosis required a new spiritual cure. And the plan they came up with was even more bizarre and far more dangerous than the first. The plan was born from sheer desperation, a turn from the scientific to the superstitious. Having blamed the angry Saint Vitus for the plague, the city magistrates decided the only way to end the curse was through penance and pilgrimage. They ordered that the remaining dancers, the ones who hadn't yet collapsed from exhaustion, be taken to a shrine. But not just any shrine. They were to be taken to a cave chapel high in the Vosges Mountains, near a town called Cerverne. This place was sacred to Saint Vitus. The belief was that if they could get the cursed dancers to this holy site, they could pray for forgiveness and appease the angry saint. It was a logistical nightmare. How do you transport hundreds of people who cannot stop moving? They were rounded up a task that was chaotic and heartbreaking. Healthy citizens, now acting as guards, had to physically restrain the dancers, their limbs still jerking and flailing. They were bound and loaded onto wagons like livestock. Families wept as they watched their loved ones, their faces gaunt and their eyes vacant, being carted away. The procession that left Strasbourg was a vision from a fever dream. A long line of wooden wagons, rumbling slowly out of the city gates, each filled with convulsing bodies. The only sound was the creaking of the wheels and the endless, muffled thudding of feet and fists against the wagon floors. To make matters worse, the officials had a very specific instruction for the dancers once they reached the shrine. They were to be given small red shoes. They had to circle the altar dedicated to Saint Vitus, an act of ritual submission. The authorities even had priests give them small crosses and holy water. They were treating a medical mystery as an exorcism. They believed this combination of religious ritual and public penance would finally break the spell. It was their last hope as the grim procession made its slow, agonizing journey into the mountains. The whole city held its breath, praying this would be the end of their suffering. But instead of a cure, this decision would only fuel the chaos even further. The wagons, filled with their twitching human cargo, finally creaked to a halt at the foot of the mountain. The air here was different, cooler, smelling of damp earth and pine. Before them was the shrine of Saint Vitus, a chapel carved into the rock, its entrance like a dark, gaping mouth. This was the place they believed would bring salvation. It would only bring more horror. The dancers were unloaded, their bodies limp with exhaustion, but their limbs still in constant, jerky motion. Priests, holding crosses and vials of holy water, met them with grim determination. They saw not sick townspeople, but vessels of demonic influence. This was not a hospital. It was a battlefield for souls. Following the magistrate's orders, the dancers were forced into small, bright red shoes, a bizarre and cruel detail in the unfolding tragedy. Then, one by one, they were dragged before the altar of Saint Vitus. The priests began to chant, their Latin prayers echoing off the cold stone walls of the cave chapel. They held up crosses to the dancers' faces, commanding the evil spirits within to depart. They sprinkled holy water on their foreheads, a gesture that should have burned any demon. But nothing happened. The dancers' bodies continued to twitch and spin, completely oblivious to the religious rites. Their eyes, vacant and unfocused, stared right through the priests, the crosses, the holy altar. They were there in body, but their minds were somewhere else entirely, lost in a prison of endless motion. The priests grew more frantic. Their chanting became louder, more desperate. They performed full-blown exorcisms, shouting at the unseen forces they were so sure were responsible. But their words had no power here. Their faith was met with a terrifying, twitching silence. It was like trying to exorcise a hurricane. The city officials who had accompanied the grim procession watched, their faces pale. They had abandoned medicine for faith, and now faith was failing them too. They had tried everything they could think of, from the logical to the mystical, and the plague danced on, uncured and untamed. As another day passed, with the priests exhausted and their rituals proven useless, a chilling realization began to settle over them. They had believed there were only two possibilities: a sickness of the body or a curse on the soul. But what if it was neither? The dancing persisted, a silent, screaming testament to their failure. Was this really a spiritual curse? Or was it something else entirely? As the rituals at the St. Vitus shrine failed, a new and even more terrifying piece of information reached the desperate officials. The plague was no longer confined to Strasbourg. Reports began to trickle in from the surrounding towns and villages nestled in the Rhine and Moselle river valleys. The dancing had started there too. A farmer in a nearby village, after hearing tales from Strasbourg, suddenly began to dance in his field. In another town, a group of women who worked by the river were seized by the same uncontrollable convulsions. It was spreading like a wildfire, leaping from one community to the next. The wagons of dancers they had sent away from Strasbourg hadn't contained the problem. It was as if the very idea of the plague was enough to make it real. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because, as historians and scholars looked back, they realized this wasn't an isolated incident. The dancing plague of 1518 was the most famous, the deadliest, but it was not the first. It was simply the peak of a strange phenomenon that had been erupting across Europe for centuries. Go back over 100 years to 1374. In towns all along the Rhine River, not far from Strasbourg, thousands of people were suddenly consumed by a similar dancing mania. They danced for days, shouting, screaming, and claiming to see visions. Go back even further to the 1200s. A group of children in Erfurt, Germany, danced all the way from their town to a nearby city, many collapsing from exhaustion along the way. Local legends even speak of a similar event in the 1020s. It was a pattern, a recurring nightmare that seemed to surface every few generations, primarily in this specific region of Europe. The people of 1518 might not have known the full history, but the stories and legends were there. Whispered from parent to child, stories of the dancing sickness. So the question wasn't just what was causing it. The question became, why was it happening here, in this specific part of the world? And why was it happening now? What was it about this time and this place that made people susceptible to being consumed by a dance they could not control? This wasn't just about Frau Trophia or the city of Strasbourg anymore. This was a deep historical sickness, a puzzle stretching back hundreds of years. And it raised a chilling question. What conditions had to be met for this plague to take hold? To understand the bizarre solutions the authorities came up with, you have to understand the world they lived in. In 1518, science, as we know it, didn't exist. There was no concept of germs, viruses, or mental illness. Their world was explained by a mixture of folklore, religion, and ancient medical theories that were thousands of years old. So when they were faced with hundreds of people dancing uncontrollably, their explanations were, to us, completely wild. The first theory, as we've seen, came from the physicians. It was the idea of hot blood. This was based on the ancient Greek concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these four fluids in perfect balance. If you had too much of one, you'd get sick. They decided the dancers had an excess of hot, sanguine blood. It made them manic, overheated, and compelled to move. Their solution: building a stage and hiring musicians was essentially a prescription. They thought, if the body wants to dance, let it dance until it's balanced again. It was a complete and utter failure. When the medical theory failed, they turned to the supernatural. This is where the blame fell on Saint Vitus. But why him? Well, Saint Vitus was known to have power over neurological disorders. People prayed to him to cure epilepsy, which they called Saint Vitus's dance. So they reasoned, if he could cure uncontrollable movements, he must also be able to cause them as a punishment. It was a twisted sort of logic. Their solution here was religious: penance, prayer, and pilgrimage to his shrine. This also failed. But there were other theories whispered among the terrified public. Some believed it was the work of the devil, a straightforward case of demonic possession on a mass scale. Exorcisms were attempted, as we saw, with no success. Others looked to the skies. Astrology was considered a serious science back then. Some scholars suggested that the alignment of the planets and stars was to blame. Perhaps Mars and Saturn were in a configuration that radiated a malevolent energy down onto the people of Strasbourg, causing this madness. There was, of course, no solution for that. You couldn't change the stars. And then there was the most mundane theory of all. poison. But poison from what? Some suggested, but that didn't make sense. Why would it only affect some people? And why would it make them dance? Every one of these ideas, hot blood, divine curses, demonic possession, angry planets, poison, failed to stop the plague. They were guesses made in the dark by people trying to understand an event that was completely outside their comprehension. But while their explanations were rooted in superstition, the key to this 500-year-old mystery might actually be found in modern science. Centuries passed. The dancing plague of 1518 faded from memory into a bizarre historical footnote, a story so strange it barely seemed real. The original theories of hot blood and angry saints were dismissed as superstition. But the question remained: what really happened? Modern science, with its understanding of psychology and neurology, offers a compelling and perhaps even more disturbing explanation. It's a phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness, or more commonly, mass hysteria. Imagine you are living in Strasbourg in 1518. Your life is unbelievably hard. Famine has ravaged the region for years. You are constantly hungry. Diseases like leprosy and the plague are a constant threat, lurking in the background of your life. On top of that, you live in a world steeped in superstition. You genuinely believe that saints can curse you, that demons can possess you, and that your fate is largely out of your hands. Your mind is a fertile ground for extreme stress and anxiety. You are living at the very edge of what a person can endure. Now, into this powder keg of misery and fear, a spark is introduced. Frau Trophia. You see her in the street, dancing uncontrollably. Your stressed, terrified mind tries to make sense of it. The authorities, the most respected people in your community, openly declare that this is a sickness, a curse, that it's real and it's spreading. This is where mass psychogenic illness can take hold. It often begins in a person or group under immense psychological pressure. The symptoms are real physical convulsions, pain, fainting, but they have no underlying physical cause. They are generated by the mind. It's a collective stress response, an unconscious way for a community to express an unbearable level of anxiety. Think of it like a social contagion. Fear is contagious. Yawning is contagious. In a community pushed to its absolute breaking point, a strange behavior like Frau Trophia's dancing could also become contagious. When people saw others being infected, their own brains, overloaded with fear and primed by belief, could actually trigger the same physical symptoms in their own bodies. They weren't faking it. Their suffering, their exhaustion, even their deaths from heart attacks and strokes were terrifyingly real. Their minds were, in effect, tricking their bodies into dancing to death. This theory explains why it happened in that specific region, which was plagued by hardship. It explains why it spread from person to person. And it explains why neither medicine nor religion could stop it. You can't exorcise extreme stress. You can't cure societal panic with a pilgrimage. This psychological explanation is now the leading theory. But it's not the only one. Some clues found in the very soil and grain of the region suggest a more tangible, more physical culprit might have been at play. While the theory of mass hysteria is compelling, another scientific explanation points to a physical trigger, a poison that could have been lurking in the most common of foods, bread. The culprit is a fungus called ergot. Ergot grows on rye, a grain that was a staple of the diet in 16th century Strasbourg, especially for the poor. When this fungus gets into the rye flour and is baked into bread, it can cause a condition known as ergotism. Ergotism is horrific. The fungus contains powerful, psychoactive, and toxic chemicals. One of its derivatives is lysergic acid, from which LSD is synthesized. The symptoms of ergot poisoning are terrifying, and they come in two main forms. One is gangrenous ergotism, which causes intense burning pain in the limbs, as if they are on fire, eventually leading to gangrene and the loss of fingers, toes, and even entire limbs. But the other form is convulsive ergotism. This type attacks the central nervous system. It causes violent muscle spasms, twitching, writhing, and delusions. The victims suffer from manic episodes, hallucinations, and severe convulsions. To an observer in 1518, someone suffering from convulsive ergotism would look an awful lot like they were dancing uncontrollably. This theory seems to fit perfectly. The region around Strasbourg was damp, and rye was the main crop-perfect conditions for the ergot fungus to thrive. The victims were primarily the poor, who would have been eating the cheap, likely contaminated rye bread, and the symptoms, the spasms, the mania, the hallucinations match many of the descriptions of the dancing plague. So, was it that simple? Did Frau Troffea and hundreds of her fellow citizens just eat a bad batch of bread? Maybe, but there are problems with this theory. First, ergotism usually causes gangrene, the burning sensation and loss of limbs. The historical accounts of the 1518 plague don't mention this at all. They only describe the dancing. Second, the dancing was remarkably coordinated in a strange way. While the movements were jerky, the victims danced for days on end. Ergot poisoning tends to be much more debilitating. It's unlikely that hundreds of people poisoned with ergot would all have the physical stamina to dance for weeks. Many would be too sick to even stand. And finally, the sheer number of victims. For 400 people to be afflicted, the entire rye supply of the city would have had to be contaminated. It's possible, but it seems less likely than the contagion of fear. So we are left with a powerful but flawed explanation. A physical poison that could create the symptoms, but doesn't quite fit all the facts. It raises the chilling question: could a simple loaf of bread really be responsible for turning an entire city into a dance of death? Or was it just one more piece of a much more complicated puzzle? While modern science gives us plausible theories like mass hysteria or ergot poisoning, we can't truly understand the dancing plague without looking at it through the eyes of the people who lived it. For them, this wasn't a medical mystery, it was a supernatural event. In the world of 1518, the line between the physical and the spiritual was blurry. A bad harvest wasn't just bad weather. It could be a sign of God's displeasure. A sickness wasn't just a sickness. It could be a demonic attack. Their world was filled with unseen forces, and they saw evidence of it everywhere. So when people started dancing uncontrollably, their minds didn't go to fungus or psychology. They went to curses. Local folklore was rich with tales of supernatural punishments. There were stories of vengeful spirits that could possess the living, and of powerful saints who could strike down sinners with bizarre afflictions. The curse of Saint Vitus wasn't a wild guess to them. It was a logical conclusion based on their understanding of how the world worked. Think about the power of belief. If you genuinely, deeply believe that an angry saint can make you dance against your will, and you see your neighbors succumbing to that very fate, your own mind might just make that belief a reality. The fear of the curse could become the curse itself. And then there was the idea of divine wrath. The years leading up to 1518 were full of religious turmoil. The Protestant Reformation was just beginning. Martin Luther had published his 95 Theses just a year earlier, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. Society was in a state of spiritual crisis. Many believed the dancing plague was a direct punishment from God, a sign of the end times. They saw it as a physical manifestation of the moral and spiritual sickness they felt was infecting their society. The dancers weren't just sick, they were sinners being made an example of. This explains why the Church's response was so focused on penance and prayer. They weren't trying to cure a disease, they were trying to appease an angry God. These supernatural beliefs shaped everything. They dictated the authorities' disastrous response of building a stage for the dancers. They led to the forced pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus. These actions seem crazy to us, but in their world, they were the only things that made sense. We can analyze the fungus and study the psychology, but for the people of Strasbourg, the cause was clear. It came from beyond the natural world, as the dancers faltered and died in the streets. The mystery of what was happening only deepened their conviction that they were at the mercy of forces they could not see, and so did their fear. Just as mysteriously as it began, the dancing started to fade. By early September, nearly 2 months after Frau Troffea first stepped into the street, the intensity of the plague began to wane. There was no single event that stopped it. No miracle cure was found. No final prayer was answered. It just wound down. The number of new dancers joining the macabre spectacle dwindled to a trickle and then to none. The dancers who remained, those who had miraculously survived weeks of non-stop motion, began to slow down. Their frantic convulsions softened into tremors, their wild flailing into weak twitches. One by one, they collapsed, not in death, but in pure, soul-deep exhaustion. Imagine the scene. A man who has been spinning for a month suddenly stumbles and falls to his knees. For the first time in weeks, his body is still. He looks down at his hands, at his bloody, swollen feet, as if seeing them for the first time. He is confused, disoriented, with little to no memory of what has just happened. He only knows an all-encompassing ache and a hunger that feels like it could swallow him whole. The city, slowly, cautiously, began to come back to life. People unbarred their doors and stepped out into the streets. The musicians had long since gone home. The stage had been torn down. All that was left was a silence that felt heavier and more profound than the chaotic noise it replaced. Why did it stop? There are a few possibilities. The simplest explanation is that the plague had simply burned itself out. It had consumed so many, either through death or utter physical collapse, that there were few susceptible people left for the contagion to spread to. The human fuel for the fire had been exhausted. It's also possible that the interventions, as clumsy and misguided as they were, eventually had an effect. Removing the dancers from the city's public eye and taking them to the shrine of St. Vitus, while it didn't cure them, did break the cycle of public spectacle. With the dancers gone, the daily visual trigger for the mass hysteria was removed. The social contagion couldn't spread if there was nothing to see. Or perhaps the season changed, as the oppressive heat of summer gave way to the milder days of autumn. The collective stress and pressure on the community may have eased just enough to break the fever pitch of the panic. But no one knew for sure. The dancing had stopped, but the questions hadn't. The survivors woke up as if from a terrible dream, with fractured memories and traumatized bodies. The city of Strasbourg was left to bury its dead and grapple with a profound, terrifying mystery. What exactly had just happened to them? The silence that fell over Strasbourg was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy silence of trauma. The city had been a prisoner of the dancing for an entire summer. And now that it was free, it was left to survey the damage. The plague left deep scars, not just on the bodies of the survivors, but on the soul of the city itself. In the immediate aftermath, there was the grim task of counting the dead. Hundreds had perished. Families had been torn apart. For those who survived the dancing, the recovery was slow and agonizing. They were weak, malnourished, and haunted by fragmented memories of their ordeal. Many suffered from chronic pain and physical ailments for the rest of their lives. The event was so shocking, so outside the realm of normal human experience, that it was meticulously documented. The city chronicles, parish registers, and even sermons from the time all record the bizarre events of 1518. It wasn't a forgotten myth. It was a carefully recorded catastrophe. These records are the reason we know so much about it today. Art from the period also reflects the horror. A famous woodcut by the artist Peter Bruegel the Elder, created a few decades later, depicts a similar dancing mania. It shows peasants in a trance-like state, dancing wildly before a church, their faces contorted. It captures the blend of religious fervor and physical suffering that defined the plague. It shows that the event burned itself into the cultural imagination of Europe. But the most significant change was psychological. The people of Strasbourg had seen the absolute fragility of their world. They had tried medicine, and it failed. They had tried religion, and it failed. They were confronted with the terrifying reality that there were things in the world, in their very own minds, that were beyond their control and comprehension. This event became a dark legend, a cautionary tale whispered for generations. It served as a stark reminder of the thin line between order and chaos. And while the world moved on, and science eventually began to offer explanations, the story of the dancing plague never truly went away. It became a piece of history so strange that it challenges our own modern assumptions about the human mind and the power of belief. The dancing plague of 1518 faded into the past. But its strange, unsettling echo resonates even in our world today. So, after traveling back 500 years, sifting through the horror, the failed cures, and the strange theories, where do we stand today? What is the final verdict on the dancing plague of 1518? The unsatisfying but honest answer is, we still don't know for sure. The mystery endures, and the debate among historians and scientists continues. Today, the leading theory remains mass psychogenic illness. It's the explanation that best fits the broad strokes of the event. The immense social and psychological stress of the time, the power of superstition, and the contagious nature of fear all point towards a collective mental breakdown. It explains why it spread so fast, why it affected so many, and why it seemed impervious to both medical and religious intervention. In this view, the people of Strasbourg were victims of their own minds. Their unbearable anxiety channeled into a physical, deadly performance. But the ergot poisoning theory refuses to go away. It has the advantage of being a physical cause for a physical symptom. The idea of a contaminated food source causing convulsions and mania is scientifically plausible. While it has its flaws, the lack of gangrene reports, the sheer stamina of the dancers, some researchers argue that a specific type of ergot, combined with the population's malnutrition, could have produced the unique symptoms seen in 1518. They argue we shouldn't dismiss a biological cause so easily. And then there are theories that combine the two. Perhaps it wasn't one or the other, but both. Maybe a low-level ergot poisoning did trigger the initial symptoms in Frau Troffea and a few others. It could have caused the initial spasms and confusion. Then, in the hyper-stressed, superstitious environment of Strasbourg, that physical trigger sparked a much larger wave of mass hysteria. The poison started the fire, and the psychology fanned the flames into a citywide inferno. This combination theory is appealing because it patches the holes in both of the leading explanations. It provides a physical starting point for the hysteria, and it explains why the symptoms were so uniform and widespread. Ultimately, we are trying to diagnose an illness across a gap of 5 centuries. We have the historical records, but we can't run blood tests. We can't interview the patients. We are left with educated guesses. The dancing plague serves as a powerful reminder that there are limits to our understanding, especially when it comes to the complex interplay between the mind, the body, and the world we live in. Even now, a new archaeological find or a re-examination of old texts could rewrite this strange and terrifying tale. So why, after 500 years, are we still so captivated by this story? Why does the image of Frau Troffea dancing herself into oblivion still hold such a strange power over our imagination? It's because the dancing plague of 1518 touches upon our deepest fears about control. We like to believe we are the masters of our own bodies, the pilots of our own minds. This story presents us with a terrifying alternative: the idea that our own bodies can betray us, that our minds can be seized by a force we don't understand, forcing us into actions we cannot stop. The mystery itself is a huge part of its enduring appeal. If we knew for certain it was ergot poisoning, it would become a medical curiosity. If we could prove definitively it was mass hysteria, it would be a case study in a psychology textbook. But because it remains unsolved, it lives in that fascinating gray area between science and folklore, between history and horror. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How fragile is the human mind? How susceptible are we to the fears and beliefs of the people around us? Could something like this, in some form, ever happen again? In our modern world, we see faint echoes of it. We see how quickly misinformation and panic can spread online, a kind of digital contagion. We understand the immense pressure that social and economic stress can put on a community. The story of the dancing plague isn't just about a strange event in the 16th century. It's about the very nature of human society and the mysterious connection between our inner world and our physical reality. It's a historical puzzle with missing pieces, and we are drawn to puzzles we cannot solve. The dancers of Strasbourg have been silent for centuries, but their story continues to speak to us. The dancing plague of 1518 stands as a haunting reminder that some mysteries defy easy explanation, leaving us forever to wonder about the dark, strange, and untamable power of the human mind.